Om Vasudevasutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. We are finishing up chapter 7 of the Bhagavad Gita. We got up to verse 23 in our last class. We might even finish it. We might go 24 through 30 today, but we don't want to rush. But that's the target. And a heads up on the next class, the very end of the month, Sunday, November 30th at 9:30 a.m. PST. And the assignment is, there's a reason why, there's a method of my madness. I already assigned the chapter, even though it covers a lot of verses that we haven't discussed yet. The reason being, it's one of the most difficult chapters in the entire commentary, Essays on the Gita, and it needs to be reread multiple times, in my opinion. So the assignment for the November 30th class is to reread the Supreme Divine chapter of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita. That is part 2, chapter 3, and it's called The Supreme Divine. Pages 289 through 300. Okay, 11 pages, but very dense. This is one of the most technical parts of the Gita itself. It just suddenly Krishna decides to introduce a bunch of technical terms. Adhyātmam, Adhiyajnaḥ, a bunch of things. Adhibhūtam. And so that's not, Sri Aurobindo is not to blame. Krishna is to blame. And then Sri Aurobindo is just, he's saying, okay, Krishna's introduced all these technical terms, we have to explain it technically. And so it's a difficult, demanding, challenging chapter. It requires full concentration. Put your phones on silent. And so the assignment is to reread that chapter, which you're supposed to have at least started to read today, the Supreme Divine, and answer the study questions based on this chapter. And the chapter covers, this chapter, the Supreme Divine, covers the last 2 verses of chapter 7, which we may or may not get to today. The very last 2, 29 and 30 of chapter 7, because suddenly Krishna just introduces some technical terms at the very end of chapter 7 without any prelude. And then chapter 8, the very beginning of chapter 8, Arjuna's totally confused and says, hey, what are all these terms you're introducing? And then Krishna proceeds to give an answer, giving technical definitions to his technical terms. And so this chapter, the Supreme Divine, which we're going to discuss in detail starting next class, is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of these technical terms introduced in chapter 7 and then elaborated in the beginning of chapter 8. Are you following? So that's kind of our trajectory. Okay. And so after a long time, there's a bunch of study questions. This is probably one of the hardest set of study questions you'll get because the chapter itself is difficult and because the terms themselves are open to so many different kinds of interpretations. But do your best. And I even threw in a final optional question for those who, and it's about having to do with Shankara's and Ramanuja's interpretations of the technical terms. But the mandatory questions concern Sri Aurobindo's and Tapasenaji's interpretations, because I think they're more relevant to our class, which is Ramakrishna themed. Okay, so that's it. So please submit the answers to the study questions by Saturday, November 29th, 7 p.m. PST, as usual. Okay, so now, since we're nearing the end of chapter 7, I thought it'd be useful, because it's actually a pretty complex chapter in a number of ways, especially compared to the previous chapters. I thought it'd be helpful to get a kind of bird's eye view of what ground we've covered in chapter 7 so far, so that's what I've written on the board. Sri Aurobindo, essay always stands for Sri Aurobindo. So Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of chapter 7 of the Bhagavad Gita. Here's how I roughly see it. If you recall, way back when we discussed the beginning, the first few verses of chapter 7, Sri Krishna makes this seminal distinction between jnana and vijnana. Okay? I don't want to say for the first time, because the terms are introduced in chapter 3, but without any explanation. This time, it becomes kind of the keynote of the entire chapter, to the point where, traditionally, chapter 7 is titled Jnana Vijnana Yoga. That's how important the concepts of jnana and vijnana are in chapter 7. Jnana Vijnana, which means the whole focus of chapter 7 are these concepts of jnana and vijnana. And what did we find? According to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, jnana is the knowledge of non-dual Brahman, or non-dual Atman, the non-dual self with a capital S, which is impersonal, attributeless. Okay? And vijnana is the more expansive realization of the impersonal, personal Purushottama manifesting as this entire universe. And this, of course, maps on perfectly to Sri Ramakrishna's distinction between jnana and vijnana, with the roof and the staircase and all that, right? We all know that. Okay, so that's introduced in 1 through 3. Remember the beautiful verse 3, Manushanam Sahasreshu, among hundreds of thousands of people, only a few strive after perfection. Among those perfected strivers, yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam veti tattvadaha. Among those strivers who have attained perfection, only a few attain me, says Krishna, which suggests these two stages of perfection. Again, mapping on, Sri Aurobindo says, look, that maps on beautifully to the terms jnana and vijnana. So the first stage of spiritual perfection is jnana, the knowledge of the non-dual Atman. But the second higher stage of perfection is the stage of vijnana. So vijnanis are an even rarer subgroup within the perfected souls. Okay, that's all 1 through 3. 4 through 12, if you remember, another crucial kind of technical distinction is introduced by Krishna. 2 kinds of prakriti, 2 kinds of nature. An inferior and superior. Apara prakriti and para prakriti are introduced. Okay? And Krishna says he manifests as all the insentient entities in the world as apara prakriti, as the inferior prakriti, as the lower prakriti. And he manifests as all jivas, conscious individual souls, as para prakriti, the supreme nature, the supreme soul, as Shakti itself in a more direct way. Okay, so and then you remember there are a few verses saying I am the so and so, the essence of all these different things in the world, right? So manifesting is everything. There's nothing but the Purushottama manifesting as both insentient and sentient entities. That's covered in verses 4 through 12. Okay, so this is the Vijnani's vision of the world. Suddenly, there's a shift in verses 13 through 15. In those verses, Krishna explains that most people, however, fail to attain this knowledge of Vijnana, and because why? They're deluded by Maya. And Maya is specifically defined in those verses as Sadaivi Hesha Gunamayi Mama Maya Duratya. So Maya is defined in terms of the 3 gunas. Maya is composed of the 3 gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. So most people don't realize Krishna, the Purushottama, because they're deluded by the 3 gunas. Then verse 16, this very important verse, which is a kind of linchpin for the entire chapter. Chatuvidha bhajantemam, 4 kinds of people who are all good worship Krishna. And we talked about it at length, I'm not going to go over it again. So arto jigyasura tati, but finally the highest, the best kind of worshipper of Krishna is the jnani, the knower of Krishna, the knower Purusha. Of course you're going to worship and call on God if you know God to be the absolute truth, the highest reality, right? So the best kind of worshipper is the jnani. Now, you might get a little confused here. So the best of the 4 are what he refers to as the jnani. Okay, but now we shouldn't be too nitpicky about, well, jnani. So I think it would be a mistake to say that if the term jnani used in verse 16 to refer to the best kind of bhakta of Krishna equals the one who has attained jnana. That would be a serious mistake, in my opinion. Instead, the jnani referred to in verse 16, who is the best of all worshippers of Krishna, refers to the vijnani. Okay. So this is so important. I'm going to write this because So the jnani, this is equivalent to the jnana referred to in 7.16. Okay, that's very, very important, and for the rest of the chapter too. Okay, so now 17 through 19 go on to explain that. Who is this jnani who's the best of the 4 kinds of worshipper? And he makes it absolutely clear that it corresponds to the vijnani explained earlier in the chapter, because this is a person who is full of ecstatic bhakti for the Purushottama, who is both the impersonal Atman and at the same time the personal God, manifesting as everything in the world. Vasudeva sarvam iti samahatma sudurlavaha. The great souled one, this is the famous verse 19, which so inspired Sri Aurobindo that he had the realization in jail when he was practicing the sadhana of the Gita, when he was imprisoned for his political activities, 1908 to 9. So this verse 19, he literally had this vision of Vasudeva as the prisoners, as the security guards, as the grating on the prison bars, the blankets that were draped over himself when he was sleeping. Everything is Vasudeva. So that is the ultimate vision of the Vijnani described in verse 19. So that is the best of all worshippers of Krishna, the one who sees Krishna as everything in this world. Okay. And then another shift suddenly. 20 to 23, verses 20 to 23, again, shifts away from those Vijnanis who realize that Krishna is all to lesser kinds of people who worship other godheads instead of the Purushottama. And we talked at length last time about exactly what Sri Aurobindo means by these other godheads. The Sanskrit term is Devata. So traditional commentators like Ramanuja, they tend to take the Devatas as Indra and Varuna and like these kinds of minor deities described in the Vedic hymns. Sri Aurobindo has a different interpretation where he suggests that these minor deities are more like gods created in our own image. And these gods to whom we go for our material wants and needs. Okay? So that's 20 to 23. Now, today we're going to finish off, hopefully finish the verses. So 24 to 27, the ones we're going to focus on today. Sri Krishna goes on to explain the same category of people who don't know the Purushottama. He says, most people don't know the Purushottama. He's explaining why. Because they're deluded by Yoga Maya. Now he introduces another term, Yoga Maya. He already introduced the term Maya in verse 15. Okay, 7.15. Daivi Hesha Gunamayi Mama Maya Duratya. And now he's introducing the term Yoga Maya. So one question that can be raised is Yoga Maya exactly the same thing as the Maya composed of the three gunas described in verse 15 of chapter 7? Or is there a subtle difference? I think in the end, at least Sri Aurobindo, and actually most commentators as far as I can tell, they interpret it as more or less identical. The Yoga Maya in this verse is equivalent to the Maya described earlier in the chapter. Okay. And then finally, the chapter ends with verses 28 to 30. Krishna comes back to the great Vijnanis. The rare few Vijnanis realize the Purushottama, manifesting as all. And beautifully, Sri Aurobindo explains stepwise how we can attain this state of Vijnana from our ordinary state of existence, and how do we reach the heights of Vijnana. So that's what I want to cover today. Okay, so let's you can use the app as usual. Let's go to verse 24 of chapter 7. We're going to read verses 24 to 26 together. So 3 verses together, and then we'll discuss them individually. Please repeat after me. Avyaktam Vyaktim Apannam Manyante Mam Abuddhayaha Param Bhavam Ajananto Mama Vyayam Anuttamam. 25. Naham Prakashaha Sarvasya Yogamaya Samavritaha Mudhoyam Nabhijanati Loko Mam Ajamavyayam. 26. Vedaham Samatitani Vartamanani Charjuna Bhavishyani Chabhutani Mam tu Veda Nakaschana. Okay, so these 3 verses kind of go together. 24. I'll explain them very briefly because there's a lot to cover today. Avyaktam Vyaktamapannam. So these verses are open to different kinds of interpretation, but I want to give the simple meaning before we go into the divergences in interpretation. So people who don't have much buddhi, intelligence, abuddhayaha, they think of Krishna, the avyaktam, who is formless, unmanifest, as limited by by manifestation, as vyaktim, as having limited by a certain kind of form. Okay, we'll talk about that in a sec, what exactly that means. Param bhavam ajanantaha, which means they don't recognize or appreciate my supreme nature, param bhavam, mama avyayam anuttamam, which is imperishable, avyayam, and anuttamam, unsurpassable, perfect. Okay, so they think of God in these limited ways. So it kind of segues beautifully from the previous verses. We'll see in a second how Sri Aurobindo understands it. Okay, so that's the simple meaning of 24. Simple meaning of 25. Na aham prakasha sarvasya. I am not revealed to everybody. Why? Because Krishna says, I am covered by yogamaya. Yogamaya samabhrataha. Okay? Mudhaha ayam nabijanati. People, dumb people basically, mudha. People who are deluded or bewildered. They don't know Krishna. Why? Or because of the covering of yogamaya, they don't know Krishna. So they don't know that Krishna is the ajam, unborn, and the avyayam, the imperishable, undecaying. Okay. And then 26. Veda aham samatitani. So Krishna is saying, I know, samatitani means past existences. Okay. Everything that happened in the past, because God is omniscient. Vartamanani ch2. He also knows everything that's happening right now in the present. And bhavishani ch2. He also knows all future beings who are going to come into existence but who don't yet exist. So he knows all our futures. Mam tu veda nakasyana. This is an interesting phrase and it's important. Mam. Krishna says, but I know all that. I know past, present, and future. But nobody, nakasyana, knows me. And so we'll talk about what the nobody here means and how we can interpret it. Okay, but now let's come back to 24 and think about it a little more deeply. And let's first look at Sri Aurobindo's commentary. This is page 286 to 7 from Essays on the Gita, so if you want to follow along. Now, this is how Sri Aurobindo explains these verses 24 to 26 together. He says, he sees them as directly following from the previous verses, talking about people worshipping lesser godheads. So Sri Aurobindo says, still, the supreme Godhead does not at all reject these devotees because of their imperfect vision. Who are these devotees? The ones described in 20 to 23. The ones who worship these devatas in their own image. For the divine in a supreme transcendent being, unborn, imminuable. Imminuable is not a word you encounter every day. It means that which can never be diminished, right? Imminuable, can never be lessened. Okay, imminuable and superior to all these partial manifestations, cannot be easily known to any living creature. He is, so that's his translation of 7.24. And then he says, now he's explaining verse 25. He is self-enveloped in this immense cloak of Maya, that Maya of his yoga, by which he is one with the world and yet beyond it, immanent but hidden, seated in all hearts but not revealed to any and every being. So I think this is a nice way of explaining 25. It's a kind of paradox, okay, is that God is immanent in everything and he's in our own hearts, and yet the strange thing is none of us seem to realize that God is here present, right? And okay, then he says man and nature. So what I think he has in mind by man and nature are the people described in verses 20 to 23, these people who are worshipping these lesser devatas rather than Purushottama. Man in nature thinks that these manifestations in nature are all the divine, when they are only his works and his powers and his veils. Let's pause here for a second. I think what he's doing is distinguishing again, without using the terms, but this is how philosophers these days refer to these two ways of looking at God. He's distinguishing between pantheism and panentheism. Okay, so the man in nature he's talking about, the people described in 20 to 23, are the ones who worship God as, let's say, just nature or something, okay, or as some kind of devata like Indra, but they limit God to just that, to that form that they perceive. instead of recognizing that God is infinite and both immanent in this world and exceeds this world, is transcendent, has a transcendent dimension. So the Vijnani is the one who is a panentheist, who realizes that God is everything in the world, but not limited by the world, not limited to the world. The world does not exhaust God's nature. God also exists beyond this world and is infinite and supreme beyond it. Okay. So that's how I see him understanding verse 25. Then he translates 26. He knows all past and all present and future existences, but him none yet knoweth. So that's a pretty faithful literal interpretation or translation, but him none yet knoweth. So nobody has realized God. If you take it literally, but so we have to talk about what exactly he has in mind here. I don't think Krishna means it in that sense. Then he says, and I want to continue because this is one of his most beautiful passages. If then, after thus bewildering them with his workings in nature, he were not to meet them in these at all, there would be no divine hope for man or for any soul in Maya. So I really like this. If then, after thus bewildering them with his workings in nature. This reminds me of Sri Ramakrishna's prayer that you find in the gospel many, many times. He says, "Oh mother, please don't delude me with your world bewitching Maya." You have to go to, because it's God who's fooling us. And so God's to blame, literally. And this is not just found in one text, but if you look at the Upanishads themselves, Paranchi Kani Vartanat Swayambhus Tasmat Parang Pashidinantaratman, from Katha Upanishad, one of my favorite verses. God himself has made the senses of human beings outgoing so that they're attracted to external things instead of looking inward. God is to blame. I mean, the blame is placed squarely on God right from the beginning, from the Upanishads and in the Gita too. And so, yeah. So how can you blame us for being bewildered in so many ways by being deluded by Maya? Whose Maya is it? It's God's Maya, right? God's own yoga Maya. So that's why we always have to keep in mind Swami Vivekananda's teaching that in spiritual life we don't move from error to truth, but from lower truth to higher truth. And these are lower truths. This is a stage, but it's a necessary stage for many people to worship God in their own image, to go to God for their petty desires and so on and so forth. But at least what happens? They strengthen faith. They strengthen their faith in God. They develop a conviction in God, and then they can take the next step to the higher truth. Okay, so then Sri Aurobindo says, therefore, according to their nature, as they approach him, he accepts their bhakti and answers to it with the reply of divine love and compassion. He's reiterating verse 21, if you remember. This is verse 21 from chapter 7. These forms are, after all, a certain kind of manifestation through which the imperfect human intelligence can touch him. These desires, these worldly desires, are first means by which our souls turn towards him. Nor is any devotion worthless or ineffective, whatever its limitations. It has the one grand necessity, faith, shraddha. And then, quote, whatever form of me any devotee with faith desires to worship, I make that faith of his firm and undeviating. So he's just quoting, what's the exact verse here? 24? 22. 22, thank you. Yeah. Okay, then. By the force of that faith in his cult and worship, he gets his desire and the spiritual realization for which he is at the moment fitted. Lower truth. You see how it's going from stage to stage. And then one of my favorite sentences, and I think Patty and maybe someone else in the responses to the study questions previously also mentioned that they really like these sentences. By seeking all his good from the divine, he shall come in the end to seek in the divine all his good. Are you following? And it's a beautiful kind of rhetorical thing going on here. By depending for his joys on the divine, he shall learn to fix in the divine all his joy. By knowing the divine in his forms and qualities, he shall come to know him as the all and the transcendent, who is the source of all things. Okay, so what is he saying? He's thinking of these two different stages. The lower truth is, you go to God, you seek all your good from the divine. So, oh God, give me a promotion, cure my child of cancer, or this and that, right? These kinds of worldly desires. He shall come in the end to seek in the divine all his good, right? And so the whole play, I've mentioned it many times, but when Swamiji's father dies and they're in dire poverty, the family's in dire poverty, he goes to Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna says, go to Kali and ask her for your family's welfare. And he can't. And he can only pray for higher things like bhakti and vairagya. So Naran finds that he when he goes to the divine, he finds in the divine all his good. He forgets about everything else. Okay. By depending for his joys on the divine, he shall learn to fix in the divine all his joy. So most of us our joys are divided. We have a million joys because we enjoy many things in the world, and we also enjoy God a little, if at all, right? But the first step is appreciating and thanking God for those worldly joys that we have and that we take value, that we value. And then slowly what happens through purification, this is something I mentioned in some of my other classes, the Gospel class and other classes, the Yoga Sutra. Kierkegaard, the great Danish Christian thinker, he defines purity in a very positive way. He says, purity of heart is to will one thing. So to desire only one thing, God and God alone, and nothing else, right? So that's the higher thing, I think, that he's thinking. He shall learn to fix in the divine all his joy. Everything else just feels flat without God, right? So you only desire God. And purity, instead of saying that purity is you have to renounce everything, and it sounds very negative and austere and this and that, but what's the goal of purity? The idea of purity is I want God and God alone. That's all that purity really means. Okay. Then there's this really important paragraph where he explains the Vijnana worldview, I think very succinctly and powerfully. So this is page 287. Sri Aurobindo says, thus by spiritual development, devotion becomes one with knowledge. Bhakti and Jnana become one. The jiva comes to delight in the one Godhead, in the divine known as all being and consciousness and delight. Being, sat, consciousness, chit, delight, ananda, sat, chit, ananda, and as all things and beings and happenings, but manifesting as this entire universe. As Sri Ramakrishna would always say, the Vijnani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. Known in nature with a capital N. What is that known in nature? Here he's bringing in the triple Purusha concept from chapter 15 as always. So this is Kshara Purusha, right? Very good. Known in nature. Then known in the self. This Akshara Purusha. And this is the non-dual self. Known for that which exceeds self and nature. Purushottama. Right? The third Purusha talked about in chapter 15. So this is the Vijnani he's explaining. He is ever in constant union with him, nitya yukta. So he's referring to the phrase used in 7.17 of the Gita. Always connected with the divine in all circumstances. Okay, talking to God, worshipping God, surrendering to God. His whole life and being are an eternal yoga with the transcendent, than whom there is nothing higher. With the universal, besides whom there is none else and nothing else. On him is concentred all his bhakti, eka bhakti. That's the phrase used in verse 17 of chapter 7 as well. Not on any partial godhead, rule, or cult. This single devotion is his whole law of living, and he has gone beyond all creeds of religious belief, rules of conduct, personal aims of life. He has no griefs to be healed, for he is in possession of the all-blissful. He has no desires to hunger after, for he possesses the highest and the all, and is close to the all-power that brings all fulfillment. He has no doubts or baffled seekings left, for all knowledge streams upon him from the light in which he lives. He loves perfectly the divine and is his beloved. For as he takes joy in the divine, so too the divine takes joy in him. So again, he's coming back to verse 17. He sees this as verse 17 of chapter 7 as really, really important, explaining the Vijnani. This is the God lover who has the knowledge, Jnani Bhakta. So he's thinking of the Vijnana knowledge. And this knower, says the Godhead in the Gita, is myself. The other sees only motives and aspects in nature, but he, the very self-being and all-being of the Purushottama, with which he is in union. His is the divine birth in the supreme nature, integral in being, completed in will, absolute in love, perfected in knowledge. In him, the jiva's cosmic existence is justified because it has exceeded itself, and so found its own whole and highest truth of being. So that's how the chapter ends. Okay, so now, let's go through some of these verses carefully here. So, 24. As far as I can tell, 24 to 26, all these verses, Sri Aurobindo is pointing out that the people deluded by yoga maya or maya are those who don't recognize Krishna as what he is, which is the Purushottama, the infinite Purushottama. Tapasyanandaji has a bit of a different interpretation. And I want to share that with you. This is page 212 of Tapasyanandaji's commentary, and it's his note 6. So Tapasyanandaji says, The materialistic or the common sense point of view of man is expressed in Gita 2.28, where it is said of man. So he's going back to chapter 2. Living beings came from where we do not know, avyaktadini. They are seen as distinct individuals in the middle, vyaktamadhyani, and they pass away into where we do not know, avyaktanidhanani. It's a kind of materialistic worldview. It's like we don't know whether consciousness persists after death and all that. It's just so let's live it up now. Okay, ordinary men, especially most of his contemporaries, he's talking about the contemporaries of an avatara, take the Lord incarnate only as an ordinary man, may be with great powers, with the background and future as described in the verses quoted above. It will be seen that this was true of Rama, of whom even many of the rishis declared that they knew him to be the son of Dasharatha and not as the divinity incarnate. Even Krishna was not recognized by many of his contemporaries as anything more than a great Yadava, though, according to the Bhagavata account, many great men and those who came into intimate contact with him recognized his divinity. Here in the verse under comment, it is said that this is the case with the average men who are characterized as abuddhaya, ignorant, people lacking buddhi, intelligence. It is probably worldly attachments that stand in the way of their recognizing him. The recognition and worship of the incarnation stands on a different footing from that of deities. The Lord incarnate is hypostatic with the Supreme Being, and his worship is the worship of the Supreme Being himself. Devotion to the Lord incarnate leads directly to bhakti, jnana, and mukti. But the background of the divine incarnate, making him specially significant, is his being rooted in the supreme divinity. He is the anugraha shakti, the redeeming power of God, manifesting as an embodied being for a cosmic purpose. Men at large are not able to plumb the depths of the personality of the incarnate and grasp his transcendental significance. So I think that there's an interesting difference between Tapasanji's interpretation of these verses and Sri Aurobindo's. I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, but according to Tapasanji, Krishna is saying, hey, most people don't recognize that me, God incarnate, am actually the divine. They think of me as a charioteer and so on and so forth. They see me as a human being, but not as God. Okay. Now, Sri Aurobindo doesn't see these verses as specifically referring to the avatara so much as the Purushottama, people not recognizing the Purushottama. And I think there's some contextual justification, I think more in favor of Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, because he explains how these verses segue from the previous verses, where people are worshipping lesser godheads. So that seems to be the context. There doesn't seem to be a specific mention of the human form of God, the avatara, here. Whereas, just skipping ahead a bit, in chapter 9, the opening verses are all about Krishna saying, hey, I am the incarnation, and fools, that most people are fools, they don't realize that I am the divine himself incarnating in this human body. So I think in terms of context, chapter 9 I think what Tapasanji is saying here applies better to the verses in the beginning of chapter 9. That's just my own feeling, that you guys can decide that for yourselves. But as usual, Tapasanji often follows Ramanuja. If you look at Ramanuja's commentary on these verses, he's talking about the avatara. He's talking about Krishna saying, hey, people just think of me as a human being. They don't see me as God. Okay. So I think in a way Tapasanji is slightly maybe misled by Ramanuja here in that way, because I don't think we're quite there at the avatara concept in this context. Okay. Now, 25, Yoga Maya. Here, Sri Aurobindo just takes Yoga Maya to be a synonym for Maya, which was mentioned just a few verses earlier, which is composed of the three gunas. People are so enamored with this world. As Sri Ramakrishna used to say, when they go to a garden, people love everything in the garden so much, they don't bother to ask who's the gardener behind the garden, the one who owns the garden and the one who's tending after everything. So that's kind of what Yoga Maya means here. Okay, but what's interesting is Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel, he uses many different variants of the word Maya. Sometimes he just uses the word Maya, and he contrasts it, for instance, with Daya, and he says that Maya is selfish attachment to me and mine, whereas Daya is a universal compassion, love for everybody, seeing the same divine and all. Okay, but then he also uses the term Mahamaya sometimes, the great Maya, and that has more connotations of divine mother in the form of Maya, mother playfully deluding her creatures. Okay, he also distinguishes crucially between two kinds of Maya, Avidya Maya and Vidya Maya, the Maya of ignorance and the Maya of knowledge. Okay, and he gives example. He says maya of ignorance, avidya maya, are things like lust, anger, greed, selfish qualities that take us further away from God. And vidya maya as spiritual qualities and ethical qualities like compassion and devotion and spiritual leanings and so on and so forth. And detachment. Okay, so and then he also in some of his prayers, like I mentioned earlier in this class, he'll refer to the Bhuvana Mohini Maya of Divine Mother. Bhuvana Mohini Maya of Divine Mother, which means the world bewitching Maya of Divine Mother. I think that's a kind of synonym for Mahamaya. And sometimes he uses the term Yoga Maya. And I want to share with you, just because, and I don't have any like pat answers to this, but I just want to raise this as a question that we can discuss. I'll give you some examples from the Gospel of where the specific term Yoga Maya is used. Okay. M tells Sri Ramakrishna, God's power is in you. That is why there is such power of attraction. It is the divine spirit that attracts. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, yes, this is the attraction of Yoga Maya, the divine Shakti. She casts the spell. God performs all her Leela through the help of Yoga Maya. Govinda, a devotee named Govinda. What is the meaning of Yoga Maya? So he directly asked Sri Ramakrishna, what is the meaning of Yoga Maya? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, it signifies the yoga or union of Purusha and Prakriti. Whatever you perceive in the universe is the outcome of this union. Take the image of Shiva and Kali. Kali stands on the bosom of Shiva. Shiva lies under her feet like a corpse. Kali looks at Shiva. So we just did Kali Puja, and this is the image, right? All this denotes the union of Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is inactive, therefore Shiva lies on the ground like a corpse. Prakriti performs all her activities in conjunction with Purusha. Thus she creates, preserves, and destroys. That is also the meaning of the conjoined images of Radha and Krishna. On account of that union, again, the images are slightly inclined toward each other. Okay. Another place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna asks a Pandit to test him. He kind of quizzes him to see how deep his knowledge is. He says, well, sir, what is Yoga Maya? And then the Pandit gives some explanation. M doesn't actually explain what the explanation is. He says the Pandit gave some sort of explanation. and then Sri Ramakrishna says, why isn't Radhika called Yoga Maya? He's really grilling this Pandit. And then M says, the Pandit also answered this question after a fashion. And then Master says, Sri Ramakrishna says, Radhika is full of unmixed sattva, the embodiment of prema. Yoga Maya contains all the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. But Radhika has nothing but pure sattva. So, taken together, it seems to me that Sri Ramakrishna, who was aware of the Gita, I think he might have even had in mind the Gita's understanding of Yoga Maya in this verse and in surrounding verses in chapter 7. Because remember, in verse, 7.15, Maya is defined as gunamayi, as composed of the three gunas, which delude most people, sattva, rajas, and tamas, and that's exactly how he's defining it here. So I think in a way, we can, if you want to make an equation here in terms of Sri Ramakrishna's use of the different kinds of Maya, the different terms describing Maya. So the Bhuvana Mohini Maya, the world bewitching Maya of Divine Mother, equals avidya Maya, the Maya of ignorance, the Maya that keeps us bound to this world and deluded by the three gunas, is equivalent to this Yoga Maya, which is composed of the three gunas. And all that's equivalent to this Yoga Maya described in Gita, and the Maya composed of the three gunas. Okay, so that's how I see it. So I don't think it includes the Vidya Maya that Sri Ramakrishna is talking about, the Maya of knowledge, which helps us to gain liberation. Okay, Sattva does, right? So basically, the Maya of knowledge would be the sattvic qualities, spiritual qualities, ethical qualities, which help untie the bondages that we have to the world and then bring us closer to liberation. So then in that case, then what I would revise that slightly. So Sri Ramakrishna says Yoga Maya is composed of the three gunas. Avidya Maya corresponds to the tamas and rajas aspects of the Yoga Maya. And the sattva aspect of the Yoga Maya, I think, will correspond to what Sri Ramakrishna calls Vidya Maya, the Maya of knowledge, which helps us to gain liberation, something like that. Okay? All right. Okay, so now let's talk briefly about verse 26. Sri Krishna says, I know all beings that have existed in the past because he's omniscient. I know all present beings and I know all future beings. Okay, but then this really interesting phrase, Mam tu Veda nakashana, but nobody yet has known me. I know everybody, but nobody knows me. What does he mean by this? Well, I don't think it should be taken too literally. It's a kind of divine hyperbole, we can say. And Ramanuja, I think, rightly points out that what Krishna means is, you very rarely find somebody who has realized the Purushottama, Krishna. Okay, not that nobody has realized God, but there are very few people. Out of all these billions of people in the world, how many have realized God? A tiny minority. So I think that's how we can take it. But there's another way, I think, of taking this. It reminds me of Sri Ramakrishna's teaching on the ant in the sugar hill. So the ant goes to a hill of sugar, with great difficulty takes 1 grain of sugar, and then comes back, gets puffed up with pride, and starts saying, next time I go back to this hill, I'm going to take the whole hill of sugar with me. And Sri Ramakrishna says, nobody can realize the whole of the infinite God. It's not possible, because it's by definition, God is illimitable. Bhagavana kono iti nei. You can never place a limit to God, which means even the greatest even the Vijnani's realization, that's not the full-blown, because God alone knows God. So if you can identify with the divine, then alone you can know the divine, right? In his entirety. But other than that, you realize forms, aspects, partial aspects. Sri Ramakrishna says to have touched the Ganga, you don't have to run your finger all the way from the source down to where it goes into the sea. Touch it at any place, you realize God, right? So even the greatest realized souls don't know the entirety of God. So maybe that's another way of thinking of Mam tu Veda nakashana. Nobody has known God in his absolute infinitude and illimitability. Yeah, illimitability. Yeah, illimitability. Oh my goodness, that's a tongue twister. Okay, so now let's proceed to the subsequent verses. So verse 27, and we're going to read 27 and 28 together. Ichchādvesha samuttena dvandva mohena bharata sarvabhutani sammoham sarge yanti parantapa yesham tvantakatam papam jananam punyakarmanam te dvandva moha nirmukta bhajante mam dridavritah. Okay, so simple meaning first, and then we'll look at Sri Aurobindo's, I think, very deep and insightful commentary on this, where he goes full-blown Vijnana mode. So 27. Ichcha dvesha. Ichcha means likes or desires, exactly. Dvesha means the opposite. So likes and dislikes. Samuttena dvandvamahena bharata. Most people are what? They're deluded by the dvandvas, the dualities of likes and dislikes. Why? That's the ego. The ego has its petty likes and dislikes, like the empirical personality. Most people are so closely identified with the empirical personality that their whole life revolves around these likes and dislikes. Okay. Sarva bhutani sammoham, and most people, almost everybody is deluded. Sarge yanti parantapa, and are therefore, they're forced to transmigrate, basically. Okay. So that's a simple meaning of verse 27. And then verse 28. Yesham. But among those there are some rare souls tu antagatam papam, who have ceased to commit any sinful deeds, who have completely eradicated egoism and selfishness in them. Jananam punya karmanam, and they only engage in spiritual actions that are helpful to others and to themselves. Punya karmanam. Te dvandva moha nirmukta, which means those people, those rare souls who are dvandva moha nirmukta, they are free from the delusion of the dualities. Dvandva, the dualities. Dvandva moha. Moha means delusion. They are free from the delusion of the likes and dislikes of their small I, the ego, the rascal I. Bhajante mam dridhavrataha. They worship God alone, and dridhavrataha, strong in their vows. Now, what exactly is the vow? We'll see in a second how Sri Aurobindo interprets this. So let's look at Sri Aurobindo's commentary on these really important verses. You can find his commentary on pages 282 to 3. Okay, so this is really practical also from the standpoint of spiritual practice, because we're talking about this very high altitude realization of vijnana, and now he comes down to our level and says, how do we attain vijnana? And he gives us steps. Okay, so Sri Aurobindo says, we have now set before us 3 interdependent movements of our release out of the normal nature, normal in the sense of our egoistic, selfish nature, and our growth into the divine and spiritual being. How do we get from where we are now to the state of vijnana? Quote, and now he's quoting his translation of 27. By the delusion of the dualities which arises from wish and disliking, all existences in the creation are led into bewilderment, says the Gita. That is the ignorance, the egoism, which fails to see and lay hold on the divine everywhere, because it sees only the dualities of nature and is constantly occupied with its own separate personality and its seekings and shrinkings. So most people are ignorant of the Purushottama. Why? Because they're identified with the small I, with the ego, and its petty likes and dislikes. So how do we get out of that condition, which is all of our conditions? For escape from this circle, the first necessity, so this is step 1. The first necessity in our works is to get clear of the sin of the vital ego, the fire of passion, the tumult of desire of the rajasic nature. And this has to be done by the steadying sattvic impulse of the ethical being. Step 1, become as sattvic as possible. That's why I emphasize this so much in my talks and classes. Because if we keep talking about just God realization, we're going to lose sight of the really urgent, practical, proximate need for us, which is to become as sattvic as possible. So that's it. He's saying that it's rajas, that's the source of egoism and selfishness. And so how do we become less rajasic? By becoming more sattvic. So let's try to bring as much sattva as possible into every aspect of our lives. So that's step 1. And again, coming back to this Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of Maya and all that. So we need to reduce the amount of avidya Maya and increase the amount of vidya Maya. And in terms of the gunas, that's why I think it's useful to think of, maybe I should write it, even though there's almost no room on the board. But, okay, so we got, in Sri Ramakrishna's terms, we got, so sattva, rajas, and tamas. What Sri Ramakrishna calls avidya Maya is rajas and tamas. Oh my goodness, now I'm reversing my letters here. Avidya Maya corresponds to the rajas and tamas, and then sattva is, I think, what you would call vidya Maya. It's the Maya, the sattvic aspect of Maya, which helps to liberate us, actually. Okay, so step 1 is reject avidya Maya and take resort to vidya Maya by bringing as much sattva into our lives as possible. Step 1. Step 2, we're not done yet. When that is done, now he's explaining verse 28, the next verse. Yesham twantakatam papam jananam punya karmanam. Or rather, as it is being done, for after a certain point, all growth in the sattvic nature brings an increasing capacity for a high quietude, equality, and transcendence. I think he has in mind, because he read Sri Ramakrishna's teachings very, very carefully, I think he has in mind Sri Ramakrishna's parable of the 3 robbers here. And that sattva robber, even though it's easy to kind of put sattva on a lower footing and say he can only take you part of the way, but remember, in the parable of the 3 robbers, sattva not only unties the poor gentleman who's been robbed, holds him by the hand, picks him up, points him in that direction, right? So that's all you really need, is develop sattva, and then the mind will become the guru and take you the rest of the way. So I think that's what Sri Aurobindo has in mind here. Don't treat sattva as just the means to the end, but if you make that your main priority, becoming as sattvic as possible, the mind will become guru, and then you'll reach the highest goal. Okay. It is necessary to rise above the dualities and to become impersonal, equal, oneself with the immutable, oneself with all existences. This is step 2. So after cultivating as much sattva as possible, what's the next step? Attaining jnana. It's what's referred to by Sri Krishna in 7.2 as jnana. Realize the one impersonal, non-dual self, capital S self, the non-dual Atman in us. But then he adds, this process of growing into the spirit completes our purification. But while this is being done, while the soul is enlarging into self-knowledge, it has also to increase in devotion. So that doesn't mean you don't practice bhakti yoga at that time. Practicing bhakti will help us to actually even attain the knowledge of the non-dual self. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, by God's grace, God can give the bhakta even the knowledge of non-dual Brahman. We don't have to separately practice the path of knowledge. Okay. Then Sri Aurobindo says, for it has not only to act in a large spirit of equality, but to do also sacrifice to the Lord, to that Godhead in all beings, which it does not yet know perfectly, but which it will be able so to know integrally, samagram mam. So this phrase samagram mam is referring back to verse 1 of chapter 7. Krishna himself defines vijnana in verse 2 of chapter 7 as a samagram, as a more comprehensive knowledge of the divine. Not just as impersonal self, but as the personal Shakti manifesting as this entire world. So that's what Sri Aurobindo is alluding to here. Okay. When it has firmly the vision of the one self everywhere and in all existences. So now he's moving to step 3. Step 1 is cultivate as much sattva as possible. Step 2 is attain jnana, which is the knowledge of the impersonal non-dual self. Step 3 is then you have to attain vijnana. Okay, attain this jnana plus bhakti, where you realize the impersonal personal Purushottama manifesting as everything in the world. Equality and vision of unity once perfectly gained, te dvandva moha nirmuktaha. So he's referring to verse 28 here. They are liberated, the Vijnani is completely liberated from the delusion of all the dualities, the petty likes and dislikes of the empirical personality. A supreme bhakti, an all-embracing devotion to the divine, becomes the whole and the sole law of the being. All other law of conduct merges into that surrender. Sarva dharman parityajya. What verse is he thinking of here? This is one of the most famous phrases in the Gita, so you should memorize it if you memorize nothing else. This is chapter 18, verse 66. Sarva dharman parityajya. Having renounced all other dharmas. Okay. So that Sri Aurobindo says, all other law of conduct merges into that surrender. So the highest ideal is just total surrender, like Sri Ramakrishna's baby kitten. And the Vijnani is the ideal of that, total surrender to the divine. The soul then becomes firm in this bhakti and in the vow of self-consecration of all its being, knowledge, works. Notice, this is his translation and his interpretation of Dhrida Vrata in verse 28. Dhrida Vrata means vow. Dhrida means firm. Firm in the vow. This is not just as spiritual aspirant who's firm in their vows of, purity and renunciation. He's talking about the highest kind of vow. And the highest vow is total surrender of yourself to the divine, of ourselves in heart, mind, and, at all levels of being.
Even beyond a standard Ishvara Paradhirana, which is not exactly just.
It's the culmination of Ishvara Pranidhana is like surrender and devotion, but this is most of us as spiritual aspirants, we try to do it imperfectly. But the one who is totally surrendered is the Vijnani alone. So it's only after you attain Vijnana that you can completely surrender to the divine. Girish Ghosh, he started with the sadhana of surrender, right? But it was imperfect. And then he told his brother disciples later when he visited the monks in Belumat, he said, when I gave Sri Ramakrishna the power of attorney, I thought my job was done and that, now I can relax. I didn't realize how hard true surrender is. And he says, now I realize that even when I lift up my arm, I feel that Sri Ramakrishna is lifting up my arm through me. So that's the heights of surrender, is that you completely eliminated self-will. Yeah.
Well, I remember this came to my mind when I was reading this chapter previously, and it just popped in.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone is familiar with the movie Princess Bride.
Of course, yeah.
Recognize this phrase.
Mm.
So I think it's like, can say, you keep using this word devotion. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Mm-hmm.
And what that is to me is that I think with knowledge and gyan, it's sort of almost self-evident that it's this capital self. It's something like the lot higher. But I think, in my mind, I think, and a lot of people may get stuck at devotion in that lower form, and it's like the devotion of ultimate self-knowledge. Like it's like almost like the Pada Bhakti that Vivekananda wrote about to me in my mind. It's like a whole other understanding of what devotion truly is. It's like non-egoic.
Yeah.
In a sense, it's sort of like loving yourself, but in a very different way than we probably can comprehend. So that's why I keep thinking of like trying to open my mind to like, what is this real devotion that's being spoken
I think
about?
we can only go so far with our intellects, right? We have to actually realize it in our hearts. And that's why, interestingly, Sri Ramakrishna in the Gospel sometimes will give these stages in spiritual realization. And he says, Sharvo Sheshe Prem. The highest of all is prema. It's divine love. You know, beyond everything, beyond even the word bhakti, he says bhakti, even bhava, all those things, beyond all that is prema. And even Swami Vivekananda, in some of his poems like Shakarprati, he says prema is the ultimate, the culmination. That goes way beyond just liberation and devotion. It's this total, and I think it has to do with total surrender to the divine. And that's how Sri Aurobindo, I think it's a very beautiful way of interpreting Dridavara, this firm in your vow. He's talking from the standpoint of Vijnana here. The vow is total self-consecration, total surrender. And then there's a really important paragraph. I want to read this. Okay. It gets heady and technical, but this is a good segue into our next class, and it'll keep our minds fresh for the coming classes. So he says, page 283. From the ordinary point of view, any return towards bhakti or continuation of the heart's activities after knowledge and impersonality have been gained might seem to be a relapse. This is a very interesting, he's addressing an important objection here. So remember the 3 steps. 1 is become as sattvic as possible. Number 2, realize the non-dual self. And then the Advaitins say, number 2, that's the highest goal. Classical Advaitins, followers of Shankara. Right? There's no step 3 after that. But then Gita says, or at least according to Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, there's a step 3. After jnana comes vijnana, exactly like Sri Ramakrishna used to say. Okay? So I think he has in mind classical Advaita Vedanta when he's saying some people will see this as a relapse. Why would you then go back to bhakti? It's like Totapuri making fun of Sri Ramakrishna. After realizing non-dual Brahman and Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Sri Ramakrishna is going back to the temple and worshipping Divine Mother and clapping his hands. And then Totapuri says, what are you, making chapatis? Right? So, relapse. This is exactly what Sri Aurobindo has in mind, I think. Now, for in bhakti there is always the element, the foundation even of personality, since its motive power is the love and adoration of the individual soul, the jiva, turned towards the supreme and universal being. Now, Sri Aurobindo is explaining, but here's where the Gita differs from classical Advaita Vedanta. This is how I see it. But from the standpoint of the Gita, where the aim is not inaction and emergence in the eternal impersonal, which is the highest goal of classical Advaita Vedanta, but a union with the Purushottama through the integrality of our being, this objection cannot at all intervene. The highest goal according to classical Advaita Vedanta, Shankara's school, is realizing your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness and realizing that everything else is an illusion. It's an illusory appearance, including the personal God. Why is bhakti considered a lower practice? Because it reinforces duality. I'm a devotee worshipping God who is separate from me. I want to eat sugar. Eating sugar means there's duality between eater and the eaten, right? So you have to transcend that to get to the highest goal, which is non-duality. But Sri Aurobindo is saying, no, that's not the highest goal. Because remember, there are 3 Purushas introduced in chapter 15, but which is already in play here in chapter 7 in the commentary. The ultimate goal is not just realization of the Akshara Purusha, the impersonal non-dual self, but the realization of the Purushottama. So Vijnana is the ultimate goal, not just Jnana. You have to realize the impersonal, personal Purushottama, and that the world is not an illusion, but it's the Purushottama manifesting as everything in this world. Vasudeva Sarvam, verse 19 of chapter 7, which Sri Aurobindo actually realized, that there's nothing but the divine Purushottama manifesting as everything. So then, Sri Aurobindo says, in this yoga, the soul escapes indeed its lower personality by the sense of its impersonal and immutable self-being. You escape from the empirical personality by realizing the non-dual self. But it still acts, and all action belongs to the multiple soul in the mutability of nature. Now we're getting into technical stuff, but it's really important. He's thinking now of verse 5 of chapter 7. What was verse 5 of chapter 7? Very important, where Sri Krishna, it is verse 5. He distinguishes 2 kinds of prakriti, apara prakriti and para prakriti. So, apareyam itastvanyam prakritim vidhi me param jiva bhuta mahabaho yedam dharite jagat. This is 7.5 of the Gita. Para prakriti becomes or manifests as each jiva in the world. And there are multiple. You have one jiva, you have a different jiva. It's Paraprakriti, which means Shakti. Just the word Shakti is basically a synonym for Paraprakriti here. That Shakti becomes each one of us in the form of the Jiva. Okay, that's what he has in mind here. That's part of the Gita's metaphysics. Okay, is that there are real Jivas. Why are they real? Because Shakti is real. So it all goes back. So think about this. In classical Advaita Vedanta, the ultimate reality is just Nirguna Brahman, the non-dual impersonal Brahman. Shakti is not ultimately real. You see. By contrast, according to the Gita's metaphysics, at least on Sri Aurobindo's Ramakrishna interpretation, just like Sri Ramakrishna says Brahman and Shakti are non-different, exactly like that, the Purushottama is defined as not only the non-dual impersonal self, but also as Paraprakriti Shakti, the personal God who creates, preserves, and destroys this world. And because of that, Bhakti and Jnana can be placed on an equal footing, and it's that Shakti which is fully real, which is not a lower truth or a lower reality. It's that Shakti that manifests as each Jiva, which means each of us as Jivas is real. We are participants in the real divine play of Divine Mother, of Shakti. That's part of the Gita's metaphysics, yeah.
There seems to be an interchangeable interaction between the two.
What are the two?
And Vijana. Is that the one is almost standing on the shoulders of the other, and then the other hops to the shoulders of the other again to be able to expand.
Yeah, so Jnana and Vijnana are somehow interdependent. Yeah, in a way, Sri Ramakrishna gives the simplest way to understand it with the staircase and the roof. Mm-hmm. Reaching the roof is Jnana. And then he says the Vijnani looks back on the staircase and says, hey, it's made of the same the material as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. And then he can go up and down the staircase at will. From the Nitya to the Lila, back from the Lila to the Nitya, and so on. Exactly. So that's the idea. Okay. Then he says, in this yoga, the soul escapes indeed its lower personality by the sense of its impersonal and immutable self-being, but it still acts, and all action belongs to the multiple soul in the mutability of nature, because the jiva is real. If we do not bring in as a corrective to an excessive quietism the idea of sacrifice to the highest, we have to regard this element of action as something not at all ourselves, some remnant of the play of the gunas without any divine reality behind it, a last dissolving form of ego, of I-ness, a continued impetus of the lower nature for which we are not responsible, since our knowledge rejects it and aims at escape from it into pure inaction. Okay, unless you have some background in classical Advaita, this might be obscure to you. I think what he's thinking of here is both Sankhya and classical Advaita Vedanta. They have this idea of prarabdha karma. Okay, prarabdha karma. And the way that classical Advaitans explain the jivan mukta, which is after attaining liberation, why are you still in the body? Why are you still in the body? Classical Advaita says the body itself is part of the illusion. So isn't being in the body still while being liberated somehow a fall from the heights of the highest Advaitic knowledge? And the answer in a sense is yes. And what the classical Advaitans say, if you look at texts like Jivan Mukti Viveka by Vidyaranya and other texts, what they say is, and even Shankara will say this, the reason why after liberation the Jivan Mukta is still in a human body is because of prarabdha karma. You have to just exhaust whatever remaining karma you have. So you're still going to go through the motions of eating and drinking and all that and giving discourses if necessary. But it's just mechanical. It's like the metaphor used by Sankhya is a potter's wheel. And so you're making a pot, the potter's making, and even after the pot's made, it spins for a little bit longer. So that's it. But it's purely mechanical. This is what he has in mind. It's a mechanical play of the three gunas. But there's nothing divine behind it, because the divine is just impersonal. You've already realized it. But here, because Shakti equals Paraprakriti, because that Shakti, Paraprakriti, is real, it's the personal aspect, the dynamic aspect of the Purushottama. And that Shakti manifests as all of us. We serve the Purushottama by surrendering to the divine. Okay? And by serving the divine as well. So as jivas. So the jiva is real in that way. So that's why the goal is not just inaction, right? But the goal is to serve Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva, Sri Ramakrishna's phrase, which is you serve, literally the word jiva is used there, Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. You serve others in a spirit of worship by seeing the same divine in all jivas. Because the jivas are the divine in different forms, right? So I think it really dovetails really well with Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And then he says, I just want to finish this. He says, and now he's explaining how the Gita's metaphysics and understanding of the Jivan Mukta, the one who is liberated while still in the physical body, The Jivan Mukta is a Vijnani. So how it differs from classical Advaita. He says, but by combining the tranquil impersonality of the one self, the Akshara Purusha, which is the highest goal of classical Advaita, with the stress of the works of nature done as a sacrifice to the Lord. Okay, so continue to act, but do everything as a yajna, as a sacrifice to the Purushottama, as an offering to the Purushottama, with total surrender. We, by this double key, escape from the lower egoistic personality and grow into the purity of our true spiritual person. Who is that true spiritual person? That's the jiva with the capital J. That's the true, and I think this corresponds, this is my suggestion, to what Sri Ramakrishna calls the bhaktir ami, the eye of the devotee. The eye of a devotee. Why do I say that? First of all, as a spiritual aspirant, it's really important that we try to break our identification with the bodjat ami, the unripe I, the rascal I, the I of the ego, the empirical personality, and identify with the bhaktir ami. He says it again and again. As much as possible, identify with the eye of a devotee. I am a son of God. I am a child of Divine Mother. But he says, when he talks about the Vijnani, which is the highest realization of Vijnana, he also says, the Vijnani, after attaining the knowledge of the non-dual self, will retain the eye of a devotee. He'll retain the bhaktinami, that same bhaktinami that we try to cultivate as spiritual aspirants. The Vijnani retains that in order to serve others and to see the divine in all. Do you see? So that's why I think that what Sri Aurobindo here is calling the Gita's jiva in 7.5 equals what Sri Aurobindo calls our true spiritual person, which equals what Sri Ramakrishna calls the bhaktirami, the eye of a devotee, retained even by the Vijnani, in order to live in the world in this human body and serve others in a spirit of worship. Then he says, then are we no longer the bound and ignorant ego in the lower, but the free jiva in the supreme nature. The distinction between the lower nature, apara prakriti, and the para prakriti. So he's directly thinking of 7.5 here. Okay. So let me just make this equation so that it's absolutely clear. And I'll even put it in red. Okay. So we got the Gita's concept of jiva in 7.5. This equals the true spiritual person that Sri Aurobindo is talking about. This equals Sri Ramakrishna's bhaktir ami, which means, the eye of a, I'm rushing. So eye of a devotee. Sorry, it's terrible already. Okay. So let's just finish the paragraph. Okay. So then we no longer live in the knowledge of the one immutable and impersonal self and this mutable multiple nature as two opposite entities. So he's saying we don't see Kshara Purusha, which is this world of dynamism and perishable things, and the Akshara Purusha as two opposite entities in the way that classical Advaita does. They see them as antitheses, right? Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Everything else is unreal. But rise to the very embrace of the Purushottama, discovered simultaneously through both of these powers of our being. But then we realize the Vijnani who realizes the Purushottama, who manifests as both Kshara and Akshara. Okay. All three are the spirit, and the two which are apparent opposites prove to be only confronting faces of the third, which is the highest. This is all. And then he quotes chapter 15 of the Gita. There is the immutable and impersonal spiritual being, the Purusha, says Krishna later on, chapter 15, verses 16 through 19. And there is the mutable and personal spiritual being. But there is true, another highest, Uttama Purusha, called the Supreme Self, Paramatman. He who has entered into this whole world and upbears it, the Lord, the imperishable. I am this Purushottama who am beyond the mutable, Kshara, and am greater and higher even than the immutable, Akshara. He who has knowledge of me as the Purushottama adores me, has bhakti for me, bhajati, with all knowledge and in every way of his natural being. And it is this bhakti of an integral knowledge and integral self-giving which the Gita now begins to develop. So I think this nicely captures the whole chapter. I hope this gives us a sense of the overarching sense of the whole chapter. And I think it's not a problem that we didn't go through the last two verses, 29 and 30, because they dovetail with the first few verses of chapter 8. Suddenly Krishna starts introducing this technical terminology, Adhyātmam and Adhibhūtam, Adhidaivam. So Again, I'll repeat one more time. So next class is Sunday, November 30th, 9:30 a.m. PST. The assignment is to reread the Supreme Divine chapter of Essays on the Gita, pages 289 to 300, and to answer the study questions based on that chapter and the last two verses of chapter 7 and the first few verses of chapter 8. Answer the study questions by November 29th, 7 p.m. PST. And so I hope to see you on Sunday, November 30th. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, I didn't have time for questions.
No questions?
Well, we can take one question if you have a question.
There is an online question.
Okay, fine. Let's hear the online question.
Are avidya and vidya maya similar to apara and parashakti?
Or aparampara prakriti would be the term used in the Gita. I think we talked about this in an earlier class. I don't think so. And the reason why is because I think para prakriti is just Shakti, actually. Is Divine Mother, Shakti, the personal aspect, the dynamic personal Shakti aspect of the impersonal personal Purushottama. And so if you want to compare it with Sri Ramakrishna's lexicon, right? Sri Ramakrishna calls Divine Mother Shakti, and Brahman and Shakti are one and inseparable, non-different. And then he says, but there are two kinds of Maya that belong to that Shakti. There's avidya Maya and vidya Maya. So I don't think he's equating the vidya Maya with the Paraprakriti or Shakti. He's saying that both these forms of Maya belong to Paraprakriti or Shakti. That's how I see it. Okay? Any other questions? Or we're good? Very good. Thanks. That was a kind of a heavy class, but I think it was necessary. Thank you, everyone. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. And maybe just to give you, before you hit pause, a little heads up, just to give you a hint as to, because your head might start spinning because of all the technicalities and all that. I see the whole purpose of all this technical language, all these technical terms, is all that Krishna is doing, I think, at least on Sri Aurobindo's interpretations, is explaining all the different ways in which Sri Krishna manifests as everything in the world. That's the whole purpose of all of this technical terminology. So Adhyātmam means he's manifesting as the jiva in each of us, and so on. And how does he manifest as the different insentient entities and everything in the world? So keep in mind, keep your eye on the prize. Don't lose sight of the forest for the trees here. He's still explaining this Vijnana vision of God manifesting as everything. Okay, thank you.